Good evening, good morning. Welcome to week 7 of PSHS 6240 here at George Washington University. I just want to start off with typical announcements. Adobe Connect session this Thursday, 23 February at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And week 3 will be, or group 3 will be going with their overview of the Boston Marathon attack. So please send your slides to me before that so I can upload it into Adobe Connect session. And you'll be getting a link to that early this week. What I'll also be doing in the Adobe Connect session is a job talk. Careers in the federal government, careers in the intelligence community, careers in the defense contracting community. So please, two things. One, if you have questions, please send them to me beforehand so that I can research it so I can get you a better answer to them at the Adobe Connect session. And two, if you have expertise in recruiting, if you've been a recruiter or navigated the federal job issues or navigated the intel community, all the wickets there, please bring your insights as well into that. So if you're going to talk, you want to talk in detail, please let me know beforehand. So Boston Marathon, please get your briefing down about 25 minutes, and then we'll do a job talk for another 30 minutes or so. The American Experience documentary on PBS, one thing we don't cover a lot in this class, and I kind of regret it, is right-wing extremism. Domestic right-wing groups that, the headlines are all towards ISIS and Islamic extremist groups, but right-wing, at least in the last 5 years, has been almost as deadly as Islamic terrorism, at least in the United States. Great documentaries, two of them on Tim McVeigh and the Oklahoma City attack, as well as the Ruby Ridge attack as well. These were on PBS the last 2 weeks, and if you have time, great documentary to watch, and I might just include it for the next time I teach this class. So paper two, much better. I think this is a little bit more concrete, so a lot more of the facts came out in this paper than maybe the first one, which is a little bit more esoteric. However, there were some issues with this paper. Really, I think the major issues are, when I say impact of the science, you have to give me details. Some of you did do it. Some of you focused on, ricin and went down very specifically, or on chemical weapons and went down very specifically. But a lot of you didn't. A lot of you gave me one over the world, weapons of mass destruction issues, and didn't really focus like a laser beam on the article that you chose. I need you to do that. I can't, again, you can't talk about sarin in one sentence and then talk about fissile material interdiction in another part of the paragraph. Really focus your paper on one of those topics and expound on that. And if you want to get down into detail, again, for sarin or for the chemical weapons movement, you have to talk, again, binary, unitary, shelf life, dissemination methods. You need to get down to that level of detail so you can give a proper intel picture. And what I mean by all of those things is like binary versus unitary. Binary chemical weapons are chemical weapons that are separate, that are not harmful when they're separate, but when they're put together, that's when you cause that effect. Now, if you're a terrorist and you're transporting it, it's a lot easier to transport it separately than it is coming together. And you need to talk about that in detail so that whoever you're briefing knows that it's not really it's hard to move it if it's unitary, but very easy to move it in binary, and it presents more of a threat. But it's a lot more technically challenging to have binary chemical weapons. Dissemination of chemical weapons. That was an issue that came up. Shelf life, sarin. How long does sarin work? Again, in its unitary phase. If it only has a shelf life for a couple of months, then obviously it presents less of a threat. Those are the types of details that I was looking for in your paper to get a pretty good grade. So again, some of you did get into that level of detail. Some of you went way too broad, and that was the issue with with the paper. The one thing I'll say is that I didn't get some of the papers. If you were in the group that briefed last week, please upload the PowerPoint to the section 2 or the paper 2 window so that I can actually give you a grade. So please do that as soon as possible. And then finally, think of the Ebola scare. Ebola is a couple years old. I bring that up in previous classes, but Ebola is something that, if you're briefing a governor on Ebola, you have to use language. You have to take something very complicated like Ebola transmission rates and explain that to a governor or policymaker so he or she can go out in front of cameras and explain it to the general public. That is going to be your job if you hope to advance in your career, whether it's in the federal or in the state capacity. So taking this very complicated thing, whether it's chemical weapons attacks, ricin, Ebola, and being able to break it down to something very simple and understandable so it could be briefed to the general public so you're not panicking the general public is a skill that requires you to work on that. And I urge you to try and work on that in your day jobs as well. So again, just kind of food for thought. These papers are real world scenarios that you might have to face in the future. So week 6 review, I think we had some pretty good comments here. Just some questions that I'm going to throw out there that are relevant to week 6 and relevant to what's going on out there now, whether it's ISIS or the Orlando shooting or the current environment that we're facing. So one question is, are we more secure since 9/11? Some of you said no. And I can understand why, because we still have these intelligence failures, whether it's the underwear bomber, Boston Marathon, or even the Orlando shooting. I would maybe differ a little bit on that. And I think, again, based on the investments we've made, everything from drone targeting, which we'll talk about next week, to the Department of Homeland Security, to better interagency sharing, to watch listing functions, I think doing something on the scale of 9/11 is almost impossible to do for particularly an outside terrorist organization. Now, is it worth the hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars we spent? Well, that is that'll be a question for another time. But I think we are more secure in the sense of a 9/11 like scenario or a complex scenario where 20 people are coming in to plot and create some sort of major mass casualty event. So I believe we are more secure, but I can also see the other arguments on the spectrum as well. What do you do if you get a memo saying Bin Laden determined to attack in the U.S.? And this was in the National Geographic documentary, and the President Bush gets a lot of blame for this memo that he got a month before the actual 9/11 attacks. I don't believe it. And in fact, I'll go as far as to say that the intel was probably shameful. I don't want to say shameful, but it was so vague that it's impossible to act on. So I'm going to ask the question again to you, and again, think about it in the back of your head. You brief Bin Laden determined to attack in the U.S., and the president goes back to you and says, okay, what do you want me to do now? Do I invade Afghanistan? Do I shut down the U.S. civil aviation system? Do I ask Congress for more money for the intelligence community? What do I do? And my point of this is, if you are whether you're in the intel community or you're on the receiving end of the intel community, you have to target your intelligence so that it fits a specific purpose. If the Bin Laden determined to attack in the U.S. and then you followed up and said, sir, I recommend going to playbook 2 of our civil aviation procedure, which says more screening at the gates. People have to have more IDs when they come in. 30% of bags are actually opened up. Something like that. Then that gives the policymaker, an accurate. He doesn't have to follow, or he or she doesn't have to follow it, but it gives him an accurate sense of how big the threat is. If you were in Iraq and you were giving a briefing on IEDs on a road, and you said, "Sir, we have a threat. There's never going to be a specific threat, but we have a threat about an IED on the same road. I recommend that you have your convoys decrease speed to 25 miles an hour." Or you could say, "Sir, I recommend you stop all your convoys coming in and out." That is a huge muscle movement that you're telling a battalion or brigade commander. But if you think the threat is that warranted, then you'd have to make sure the intelligence supports it. So that's what I'm trying to explain this, or I'm trying to, if you're an intel analyst, how you communicate to policymakers. The one thing that you hear if you're at CIA or DIA is intelligence doesn't do policy. We don't do policy. We're not, we wash our hands of policy. I don't like that statement very well. I think that leads you to analysis that's imprecise, meaning you can be, let's say the 9/11 issue came up. You just say, "Sir, there's going to be an attack. Sir, there's going to be an attack. Sir, there's going to be an attack." And you said that every day, and then there's an attack. Now all you've done is done boy who cried wolf. You could say, "Hey, I told the policymaker and it was their decision," but you didn't communicate the threat in a very relevant manner. So that's what I'm trying to get at with the intelligence driving policy or intelligence driving operations, is that the intelligence has to be tailored and it has to be focused, and you should, as an intel analyst, provide recommendations to the policymaker so he or she can bracket the problem. Again, if you say something like, "Sir, I recommend that you stop traffic coming into Manhattan," that is a huge muscle movement that you should be aware of. But if you think the threat warrants it, then you can make that recommendation. Then you would have to make sure that the intelligence is specific enough and credible enough that you can do that. But again, I can't say this enough, that intel has to be relevant to policymakers, and as an intel analyst, you should make recommendations to policymakers so they can make better decisions. Was 9/11 an intelligence failure? If before I saw the Nova documentary about NSA, I might say that no, it was an intelligence failure. This is a free country. We have some restrictions, but people can travel in and out of the country. We don't. It's not a totalitarian state. People can do certain things. So to say 9/11 was an intelligence failure, I think would be, before I saw the Nova documentary, might be, it's 19 shadowy people coming into our country and then conducting this attack. Maybe that wasn't an intelligence failure. However, when I saw the Nova documentary and I saw that there were two known terrorists talking from San Diego to a known Osama bin Laden safe house in Yemen, and the National Security Agency knew that. They knew that and didn't inform the FBI, the San Diego local law enforcement, or any other part of the federal government. I think that makes it an intel failure. There was information known by an agency, and they didn't have the empathy to explain it to another agency. That would make an intelligence failure. As a secondary point, I would, it's debatable, but I would argue that the intelligence community should have been aware that an airplane could have been used as a Tomahawk missile in the way it was on 9/11. There was plenty of plots that had tried to do that beforehand. There was, they tried to do that with the Eiffel Tower, fly a commercial airline into the Eiffel Tower. So one, it was known, there was history to do that. And two, it wouldn't have taken a whole lot to make sure that a 9/11 plot could not happen. Even in those pre 9/11 days, all you had to do was reinforce the cockpit. Hell, you didn't need to reinforce all the cockpits. Let's say you reinforced 25% of cockpits on large passenger jets. That might be enough to deter a terrorist from conducting an attack. If they didn't know when they got on the plane that 1 in 4 chance they couldn't breach the cockpit because it was now an iron door, that might deter a 9/11 like scenario. You can, adding federal air marshals, again, that's not expensive in the grand scheme of things. That would have severely impacted a 9/11 scenario. Again, you don't need to put a federal air marshal on every plane, just maybe 1 in 3. Hell, if you had just explained to the airline crew, the pilots and the flight attendants about the potential that a cockpit could be breached so they could use it in a 9/11 as a Tomahawk missile. If you explained it to the crew and just had crew awareness, that could have prevented a 9/11 like scenario. If you go on a flight now, they put a baggage, and I encourage you the next time you fly, the cockpit's open, they'll put the baggage cart or the drink cart in front of the cockpit to prevent someone from breaching that. All they had to, if they had just done that before 9/11, just said, okay, our new tactic is cockpit doors open, or even if it's closed, we're just going to keep the drink cart there. That would have prevented a 9/11 scenario. Again, so even if the intelligence was a little vague or the threat was a little vague, it wouldn't have taken a whole lot of money and a whole lot of effort to prevent this scenario from occurring. So that's why I would say 9/11 is an intelligence failure. But I'll let you draw your own conclusions from there. Okay, so Fort Hood shooting. And you guys saw the video that I sent out. What point should radicalization be monitored? Pardon me. And this is for Fort Hood. This is the Orlando shooting. This is the European Union and the threat from ISIS to Europe. What point should radicalization be monitored? A lot of you talked about that video, the lectures, and it was brought up in the congressional report about Hassan, about him giving lectures about Islam and the threat of Islam in the ranks and those types of issues, and that was an indicator of radicalization. But I sent that video last week, and you saw his lecture given at Walter Reed Hospital. Was that really something you would turn around and say, oh, that guy is going to be a terrorist, or that guy's a terrorist? I don't think that was a very good indicator of radicalization. Yes, he was communicating with a known or suspected terrorist, Anwar al-Awlaki, but as you saw in that video again, people interacting with the internet with possible people affiliated with terrorists, it's a dime a dozen. There's hundreds of thousands of people who do that. In fact, Anwar al-Awlaki has about 200,000 followers on his various YouTube channels. So, that might not be a point of radicalization. Again, I ask, where is the line? If someone was surfing on a ISIS-affiliated website, what about if someone was surfing on a right-wing extremist website? We've had right-wing extremists. We had the Sikh temple shooting. We had the Dylan Roof. In fact, there was another right-wing extremist plot broken up in the last few days. When is that radicalized? If he's surfing on these websites, if he likes a YouTube channel, if he's actually actively communicating, or if he just says, hey, I'm against the Iraq war, is that a point of radicalization? And should that person be on a list for further scrutiny? And again, we live in a democratic country, so putting people on lists for saying, hey, I'm against the Iraq war, that is, let's just say, puts us on a path of not being a democratic country. So do we have the appropriate funding, structures, and personnel to stop these intelligence failures, and that's something we'll talk about in the Boston Marathon Adobe Connect session, and that's something that to bring up in your final papers. But again, you saw the intel failures related to Fort Hood shooting, and the structures were there. Just person X, who worked at the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force, informed the defense, his counterpart of the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. So it worked. It just wasn't followed up on by one side or another. Is that something that can be cured with more oversight, more money? Or is it something that just, hey, you can put as much money as you want into the system, but if that person doesn't follow up, you're going to have these human errors that happen. So ask those questions again when you're talking Fort Hood, Boston, Orlando, the underwear bombing, the Christmas Day bombing. Was it a problem of structure or funding or organization, or is it the human contact, the human-to-human contact, which you're always going to have, or is it just stuff happens, and I hate to sound like that, but in a free society, there's only so much you can do. So again, these are questions to bring up in your final paper. And then I think we have to ask, is there always going to be low-level attacks? And this brings up to what I just said. Should we accept in a free society that we'll always have Dylan Roofs and I can't remember the Orlando shooter. His name escapes me now. Or Nadal Sanz or Umar Tulubs. Should we accept that? Again in Orlando, that in a free society where guns are constitutionally protected, that someone will always be able to get a gun and massacre people in a nightclub. That's just something to think about as we go on. And then finally, intelligence versus policy debate. I think I touched on that earlier, so I just want to say that the intelligence has to drive the policy, and there's nothing wrong with intelligence giving policy recommendations to help the policymaker bracket how serious the threat is. Pardon me. So week 7 preview is leadership. So we're going to talk about two things: leadership targeting, and bracket everything in here is contemporary issues. So we'll talk about leadership targeting, and we'll talk about the domestic jihadist threat. So is leadership targeting more a strategy or just a tactic? And you'll read 2 articles on leadership targeting, Byman and Cronin. Byman is kind of for leadership targeting. Cronin is against it. So we'll let you make up your own mind on that. But, read those 2 articles and then listen to the lecture, and then, give the strengths and weaknesses of it being effective. Why is it effective? Why is it not effective? Is this just a strategy, or is it just a tactic? So kind of answer those questions, or think of those questions as you're going through this week's reading. And then we'll also do is the domestic jihadist threat. So there's 2 articles on that. There's a Congressional Research Service article. It's 200 pages. Don't read 200 pages. The first really 58 pages before you go into the annexes is all you need to read. And even the 58 pages, it's not really 58 pages because it's a lot of footnotes and pictures and illustrations. So it's really not that long of a paper. And then the ISIS in America, it's not really that long either. That's a great product put together by GW. And if you go to their website, they update the product. So please pull the latest. But it talks about, read the original article, and it talks about how ISIS uses cyber capabilities to recruit Americans, and how many Americans have gone overseas, and why they're doing this. So that's things to consider, or please read up on, so you're familiar with that domestic jihadist threat. So that wraps up week 6, or previews into week 7. What I look forward to seeing you on the Adobe Connect session. I also will give a review for the final this week, so you can start studying in week 8. Next week, again, is week 8, this week, upcoming is week 7, and then after that, I give you a week to do your final paper, as well as to study for the final as well. And I will give my next YouTube will be a review for the final, so you know what topics are going to be discussed and you know what to study. So if there's any questions, please let me know, and I look forward to seeing you on the discussion boards this week.